There we go. So this is my book. And it is about Nicholas Said. This is his 1863 photo taken in Massachusetts when he joined the Massachusetts 55th Regiment to fight in the Civil War. But he was not born in Massachusetts, nor in the United States. He was born in the country of Borno, which was one of the largest nations south of the Sahara in Africa. At its extent, the country of Borno was 1,000 years old when he was born. It was formed in the 800s AD, became a Muslim nation in about 1000 AD. At its biggest extent, very big size of combined size of the United Kingdom and Spain. So a pretty big country, although by the time he was born, this is when it was at its peak. Then famines, revolutions, civil war kind of reduced it, but still it was about the size of Spain. And that's what it looked like when he was born. He was born in the capital city of Kukula. This is the Grand Mosque of Kukula, one of the big public squares there. His father was the leading general of the army. Barkagana was his name, very renowned warrior, rode into battle as if he was in the Arabian Nights, spear in hand. He has a metal helmet underneath that turban, and he's wearing a coat of chainmail. And they had guns, they had rifles. They actually preferred spears and arrows because they didn't have repeating rifles, and those are a lot more effective. They did use them sometimes, but they did not, their military went into war very much like what he was there. This is the Sultan. He's receiving gifts from a German ambassador. He's got the ambassador has given him a throne. He doesn't like the throne. He prefers to sit, on a platform, which is what, he has done throughout his history. This is what a noblewoman would have liked, what Nicholas Said's mother would have looked like, attended to by a lot of servants and slaves. Slavery was very huge in that country for its economy, but very much different from slavery in the South. Technically, Nicholas Said's father, Barkagana, who was a governor of 6 provinces, leader of the army, commanded 5,000 men, one of the most wealthy persons in the country, technically he was a slave. He was a slave of the Sultan. So it's a little different than what you might see in the American South. Because he came from a wealthy family, Nicholas Said got a good education. He was taught Arabic, Kanuri, which was his native language, the native language of Borno. He also spoke Mandara, which is his mother's language. And taught the Quran. And if he had gone on to school, he probably would have learned Turkish, probably would have learned astronomy and mathematics. Those were the other big subjects that they were taught. But when he had finished his first stage of lessons at the age of 13, he decided, I'm going to celebrate with some of my friends. I'm going to go on a hunting trip. Hunting was a very it was one of his favorite passions. He decided to go up to the northern part of the country, and his mother sounded like an American mother warning about boogeymen. Oh, don't go up there. They're raiders. They swoop down, and they'll capture you, and they'll sell you into slavery, which is exactly what happened. This is right on the border of the Sahara. The Sahara is dominated by tribes of what are called Tuaregs, and these Tuareg nomads one of the things they do is kidnap people, sell them into slavery. If you have seen Star Wars, that's who George Lucas based the Desert Raiders on in the Star Wars movies. They based them on the Tuaregs. So Nicholas Said and about 20 of his friends were forced into slavery. They walked 2,000 miles walking barefoot across the Sahara Desert into the middle of Libya, what's now Libya, which is where they were sold into slavery. Which is where they sold to people, to other people buying them from the traders. So here he is, or an image like him. This is what he would have been doing when he was in his teens. About 13 years old he was when he was taken into slavery. So digging water out of the Sahara, out of an aquifer below the desert. They don't get a lot of rain there. So any agriculture they got needs to be fed from hauling it out of the ground. And that was what he was put to work as. He did not do a good job. He was whipped every day by his overseer, who complained that he wasn't doing a good job, because he had been used to a life of leisure, a life of luxury. He had never worked before. He'd never done any manual labor before, and suddenly he was working like a slave. So he complained. He complained to his overseer. He said, this just really isn't working out for me. You're giving me a terrible diet. I'm being whipped every day. Why don't you sell me to somebody else? Sell me to a Turk. Sell me to an Egyptian. They have a reputation for treating their slaves well. And they did. Turks had a reputation, and so did Egyptians to a lesser extent, of giving slaves allowances that would eventually allow them to buy their way into freedom. So it became almost more like an indentured servitude than slavery. Like I say, slavery there was a bit different than in the South. And you can imagine if a slave in the South had told that to his overseer, to his owner, you can imagine the reaction he would have gotten. Under Islam, you were required to listen to a slave when they asked you that. You were required to listen to them complain about their working conditions and to allow them to ask to be sold to somebody else. You didn't have to follow that, but you at least had to listen. You had to let them state their case. And the guy listened, and the guy agreed. He sold him to a Turk. And when he sold him to a Turk, suddenly his status changed significantly. The Turk trained him to be a tobacco server. And this is at a time when tobacco fuels the Turkish economy, but also it's really a prized status to serve tobacco to the rich and wealthy. It's like serving tea in China or Japan. There's a lot of ritual that comes with it. There's a lot of status. If you have friends over, good friends, then you'll give them coffee, but which is also has its own merit in the Islamic world. But tobacco is even higher than that. So he is sold to Constantinople, to Istanbul, where he becomes the property of the Turkish foreign minister. This is at a time when Turkey is negotiating with Russia, with England, with France, to prevent the Crimean War from happening. And so every day, Nicholas Said is going to these various embassies, to the Russian, and accompanying his employer or his owner at that time to treat them to tobacco and to just sit there, be a fly on the wall, and see what happens. and he really impresses the Russian ambassador. The Russian ambassador who's come down to Turkey ostensibly to make peace, but really to make war. His idea, his whole reason for being there is to piss the Turks off, because Russia wants a bit of Turkey. They want some Turkish properties. And then that is what's about to lead to the Crimean War. Now, Russia had a policy, and a lot of European nations actually did, of occasionally purchasing slaves from Turkey or from other areas, bringing them to their homeland, freeing them. There was no slavery in Russia. There was serfdom, which was almost as bad as slavery, but to be a serf, you had to be part of the Russian land. You couldn't be a foreigner and be a serf. You could, so he immediately, this is not Nicholas Said, but Nicholas Said, or any person who's been born as a slave or comes to Russia as a slave is immediately freed, immediately has a higher status than the serfs do. This is Peter the Great. This is 1720 or so. So this is about 100 years earlier. He is purchased a slave that he basically almost adopts as a son, as a godson. He names him after himself. He sends him to France to be educated. When he returns from France, is a friend of Voltaire and other people, but also trained in the military arts. He is named the third highest member of the Russian army, the general of the army. His son also achieves that rank, and his son is Alexander Pushkin. So, Russia's favorite poet. So they have, some of these people who come to Russia get great status. In France, there was a general under Napoleon whose son wrote The Three Musketeers. So, so these are Africans who come to Europe and who are treated very well. Even if they're some of them only end up as servants. Some of them only end up as, cleaning stables or taking care of horses, but they're well paid. And, they have a higher status. In Russia, they have a higher status than most Russians. Nicholas Said becomes, his name, by the way, he was born as Muhammad Ali Ben Said, but he is employed by Nicholas Trubetskoy, who is the godson of Tsar Nicholas. Tsar Nicholas gave him his name. Nicholas Trubetskoy gets Muhammad Ali Ben Said baptized into the Russian Orthodox Church and gives him his name. So Nicholas Said is indirectly named after the Russian Tsar. With Nicholas Trubetskoy, Nicholas Said travels throughout Europe, going on this grand tour, every year for 5 years. They go to Germany and Austria in the fall, Italy in the winter, France in the spring, England in the summer. And in the meantime, Nicholas Said is a sponge for languages. He just takes them on immediately. So he's speaking Russian, German, Italian, French, English. I found a minister who was vacationing in Germany, and he heard Nicholas Said speaking like to 3 or 4 different people from different countries and just switching from one to the other, one language to the other. An incredible gift for languages. And he already spoke Turkish, Arabic, Kanuri, and Mandara, and he would later learn Armenian, Biblical Greek, which was taught by a Presbyterian minister, and Hebrew. which was taught by one of the leaders of the Jewish community of Charleston, South Carolina. So, but in the meantime, because of his, friendship with his Russian prince, he's meeting the nobles such as Louis Napoleon, Queen Victoria, and Tsar Nicholas. But finally, he gets to London, and he says he would like to leave. He would like to go back to Africa at that time. And his employer is very sorry. He's saying, please stay with me for a few more years. I'll give you enough money so you can be a rich man in Africa. But no, he really wants to leave, until he meets a Dutch nobleman. He's looking for a boat to take him back to Africa. Meets a Dutch nobleman who's looking for an aid, a personal aid, just like he had been a personal aid to the Russian prince, because he's about to go on a honeymoon to the Americas. Just stick with me for a year. You can see Canada, you can see the United States, you can see the Caribbean. I'm taking this year-long honeymoon, so stick with me for a year, be my servant, and then you can have enough money to really be a wealthy man back in Africa. Unfortunately, the nobleman was a little bit of a con man, counting on money from his wife, who didn't have money. He didn't know. He thought he was marrying into English nobility, and he wasn't. So he ends up going broke in Detroit, and has to find a way to get back to Europe, and never does. He ends up, finding odd jobs in the United States for the rest of his life. But Nicholas Said, and this is right in, they get to Detroit in December 1860, and a couple months later, the Civil War happens. Nicholas Said goes to the recruitment office in Detroit and wants to join. Unfortunately, the army is for whites only at that time. And this must have come as a shock to Nicholas Said, because he knew there were Russian, in Russia and France, there had been African generals and stuff. So this was a real shock to him. He'd seen black soldiers in the English and French armies, in the Turkish army. So, the fact that there were no Africans fighting in a war about African slavery was pretty astonishing to him. And also, it just runs against American history. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, it was Salem Poor who shot the British commander. So there were, African Americans serving in the army. The 1st Rhode Island successfully beat back 3 waves of Hessians that came after them. There were Africans from Haiti who helped defend Savannah against its siege by the British, although unfortunately they were overcome. But but unfortunately he couldn't find a job there. He ended up taking a job teaching French at a private school for African American children in Michigan. Detroit had a pretty solid middle class of African Americans, actually, who were, most of them were freeborn from Virginia. They had been in Fredericksburg, and they had pretty good occupations, pretty good wealth there. Then in the 1830s, Virginia started cracking down, started writing anti-black laws, and they migrated en masse to Detroit. But they had, they were pretty good, well off. They were pretty upper middle class. And French was an important acquisition. They were right across the river from Canada, so to speak French had a value. He taught there until 1863, early 1863. major race riot in Detroit, burned down much of the African-American community there, including the school. His school was burned to the ground. But right at that time, the 54th Regiment was recruiting in Detroit, as they were in all northern cities that had any black population, recruiting, get paid $13 a month, get good food and clothing, state aid to families. A lot of that would prove to be not true, but it wasn't actually Detroit's fault. We'll get into that. It was more the federal government. So a lot of African Americans went to Boston. So many that the 54th Massachusetts was full up, and he became part of the 55th Massachusetts, formed of the runover, spillover from the 54th. But like I say, there was sort of a problem from the federal government. For one thing, Massachusetts wanted African Americans to be officers of the regiment, but no, the federal government said no, it can only be white. Anybody lieutenant or above is white. And one of the reasons it's given is, well, if white soldiers were expected to salute black lieutenants, that would cause too much morale problem. So we're just going to have, all of the officers are going to be white, but also all of the pay is going to be $7 a month, compared to $13 for a white private or $21 for a sergeant major. You get just a fraction of that. Now, this was just a rumor at the time. This was going to happen, but at the time, Massachusetts was saying, this must be a mistake. The feds are making a mistake here. Don't worry about it. And at the time, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who headed the 54th, if this pay rate is applied to our regiments, it will be great and justice, give the black troops a chance to show what they are made of. So he wants them to really, he figures a way to stave off this poor pay, the way to let them be officers and everything in the Army, give them a chance to show that they're made of what they're made of. So the 54th goes to, 54th goes to Fort Wagner, South Carolina. One of the biggest Confederate fortresses on the Atlantic. It's surrounded by a moat with abatis sticking out of the ground and rifle pits surrounding it, 14 cannons in the fort, 1,000 men. And the Feds try to take it in late June of 1863, and they don't have they can't even get to the fort. There's 3 or 4 regiments that try going a mile across the sand to the fort, and they're wiped out before they even get close. So a week later, they want to do the same thing, the same exact tactics against the same exact armaments, and it's going to be a suicide. But the general in charge says, put these guys in the advance. We may as well get rid of them one way or another. If you've seen the movie Glory, of course, then then this is kind of what happens. They have to go like a mile on the sand before even getting close to the fort. And the rebels are waiting, the Confederates are waiting. they do much better than the charge the week before, but they end up getting turned back. I'll speed through this. This is the reason I included it. It's probably my favorite Civil War movie. And actually, this is one of the things that interests me in Said, because, just the 54th in general.
It's got Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick.
There you go. Yeah, so they ended up with 106 killed, 159 wounded, 15 captured. So that's a 45% casualty rate for the troops that were involved. Very high casualty rates. There were white casualties too. Because they weren't the only troops, but they were the spearhead. And this really won them high praise from the press, from the public. But then when the Union Army paymaster arrived, he confirmed they were only getting $7 a month. And this is precisely at the time when Nicholas Said and the 55th Massachusetts arrive on Folly Island, and they arrive at their camp to reinforce them. So all of the black soldiers are pretty. Hang on, just one sec. Just a second.
Up there at Charleston.
Yeah, it's right off shore in Charleston. So when the 55th gets there, the Army decides, okay, we're not going to try another charge against them. Instead, we're going to build trenches.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll try trenches. We'll bring cannons up, which they had to pull across the sand, and it was the black troops, both white and black, were involved in the trench work. The black troops were involved in this heavy labor, such as pulling the cannons across the sand. They didn't want horses to do it because horses would make too much noise and would alert the Confederates. So they had human beings doing it. Very heavy work. And in the meantime, they were refusing to accept this pay. They were refusing to take the $7. Give us nothing. To accept our pay in this way would degrade us, would mark us as inferior soldiers. To accept this, they were saying they would be telling the world that they were inferior to white soldiers. And they did not want to do that. As a result, they refused the pay, which was technically an act of mutiny. Technically, they could be put to death with it, and they were warned that by one of their generals. But that's what they decided to do, and I think the Army was fine with that. We don't have to pay them. So beyond doing the trench work, they also helped build a huge gun battery in the middle of a swamp. 15 feet of water that they would sink sandbags into. They filled 800 tons of sandbags to build this emplacement for the heaviest gun in the military that could shoot the 5 miles into Charleston. They helped build signal towers. They helped guard the retreat from Alusty. This is the 54th in Alusty. The 55th was in the rear, but they guarded the retreat when the battle in Alusty didn't go well. Nicholas Said led 2 actions, or he led his platoon in 2 actions. He didn't lead the actions, but he was there. But in the meantime, this was taking a year already, and they were getting no money. And their families were writing to them because their families depended on this money. And originally their families were getting money from charities, were stepping in because the government wasn't. And then the charities started, that money started drying up. And so this is really causing a problem. Yeah, money is very much needed, but I do not believe there are 20 who will take less than we enlisted for. It's very shameful to treat men who expose their lives and forsake their homes in that way. At one point the soldiers decided to go on strike, or at least 100 of them did. They were, ordered back to the lines on pain of death. And one of Nicholas Said's, one of the men in his platoon was actually executed it was a confrontation with a lieutenant that probably wouldn't have happened if the pay issue hadn't been involved, but it did. But anyway, finally, they did get their money. Finally, the government did start paying them and pay them give them back pay. And the 55th was there when Charleston fell. They were among the first troops to enter the city and occupy it. After the war, most of the troops remained, most of the northern troops, of course, went back north, but Nicholas Said chose to remain. He chose to stay, and he'd been a teacher in Detroit. He had also probably been a teacher in the Union camp, teaching illiterate soldiers. And so now he decides to be a teacher of freedmen. He also becomes one of the nation's first black voting registrars. He was a voting registrar in Charleston. But people hear his story. People hear his story about Africa and everything. Hear all the tales of when he was growing up. They say, tell him, hey, that's a great story. You should be telling this to people. So he does. He embarks on a lecture tour of the South. Travels in Central Africa. Calculated to do a great amount of good among his people, but which is what the ad says. But also, it's also a biracial audience. He's also talking to Southerners about these are the accomplishments that Africans can do if you let them. So, he gets actually very good reviews from Southern newspapers. The Atlanta Constitution, he talks intelligently on almost every subject. The Federal Union, a most remarkable colored man. And the reason that they are so praising of him, back at that time, there were really two schools of thought. There was Frederick Douglass, more of the, quote, radical, unquote, who wanted to push for civil rights earlier. Booker T. Washington, who said, no, let's concentrate on education and economic achievement, and we'll get rights. We'll get rights when we earn them. Unfortunately, very naive. And in a way, both men were very naive because even if Frederick Douglass was willing to push for civil rights, the North wasn't. And the South, of course, wasn't. So neither one. It was kind of a lose-lose situation at that time. But Nicholas Said's tour takes him through the state of Georgia and everything. And then in 1871, he crosses into Alabama, gets very good reviews. And this is, while I was in Georgia and Florida, I'd heard from the black people that Alabama was a very dangerous state, filled with Ku Klux, and that the freedmen there did not know what freedom was, owing to the oppression of the whites under which they were situated. I was advised not to go to that state. My life, they said, would be in great danger. My own common sense dictated in me, of course, that it was not possible that such a state of affairs could exist in Alabama. Besides that, there were good and bad in all countries. So I crossed the Chattahoochee into Alabama, and to my great surprise was received with respect and kindness. I shall truly say I have never had a reception heretofore. And this is a businessman in Columbia who's sort of, this is a Confederate veteran, a former slaveholder, but he has very good words about Nicholas Said. I'm glad to say he gave entire satisfaction to his audience, which was composed of a goodly number of white and black people. He is by far the most intelligent and best educated man of the African race with whom I have ever conversed. So he writes a letter to William C. Oates, who was the one-armed hero of Henry County, who lost his arm in a Virginia battlefield, had famously led an Alabama charge and the Gettysburg, and future governor of Alabama. And even though he is, as many people at that time, pretty racist, he at least, and he's attacked for this because as a Bostonian doctrine, he at least thinks that there are, that some Africans are better than some whites, which not a lot of Alabamians would have agreed at that time, or at least would have publicly agreed. Nicholas Said wants to start a school. He does have what I would call a very Southern view of education at the time. It's not in the interest of the state to educate its entire population, but beyond primary school. Universal experience teaches that if a boy, without regard to his color, be educated beyond this point, he declines to work another day in the sun. And this is the way that most of the South, this is why there weren't public schools in the South, not for whites or blacks. Whites went to paid academies. So you had to have a certain amount of wealth. And this is why the illiteracy rate was so high, much higher than in the North. Neither one had great public school systems, but the North had a bigger history of public schools than the South. And that only changed with Reconstruction, because Reconstruction demanded that there be public schools for blacks. And Southerners said, hey, if you're going to do that, we need public schools for whites too. So that was the real beginning of public schools, the Reconstruction era. So Nicholas Said does teach a little public school in Abbeville, which is where Oates was from. And then he goes on to do his lecture tour. Eufaula, Clayton, Troy, Montgomery, Selma, etc. Yeah, he never got as far north as this, but he trailed this all the way. And as he was doing this, he was selling his autobiography or making subscriptions to his autobiography. He didn't have an autobiography. He was telling everybody, you pay me now, I'll send it to you when I get there. It's like crowdsourced funding of the 18th, and this is not an uncommon thing. This is a fairly common thing to do. Pay me now, I'll send you the book when I've written it. But after the 2 years of him being on the trail, there were some newspapers that were critical of him, saying, oh, he's ripping people off. The Troy Messenger accuses him of swindling persons out of small sums of money. It was only 25 cents. But 25 cents was a few dollars back then. He's a really smart fellow. He can speak every language, but not the truth. So he decided he has to actually produce an autobiography in order, he has to make good on his promise. He arrived in St. Stephen's, beautiful little town, which is in ruins now. You know, this is the first capital of Alabama, and even then it was somewhat in ruins because the railroad had come a few miles away, so everybody had moved to be with the railroad, and so the whole town was in ruins. But here he felt an insurmountable desire to put an end to my peregrinations. That is, at least for a season, for I was perfectly exhausted. And also he wanted to write his book. So he went to the town courthouse, still standing, and was told that he needed to talk to the county supervisor of education who lived in Pleasant Valley, which is now the town of Bigby. He talked to Dr. Samuel Coleman. That's not him, but this is what a country physician looked at like at the time. He was a physician, a land baron with more than 3,000 acres of land, an educator and a politician. He served in the Alabama state legislature and was also a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1865. So Nicholas Said says the doctor appeared to be about 50 years of age, with a kind and gentlemanly looking face, highly polished manners, and in stature something above the medium height. His reception of me was quite flattering, for after my examination, I was asked whether I had been to breakfast. I told him I had not, whereupon a servant girl was called and instructed me to furnish me with breakfast, which you can imagine would not have happened to a lot of African Americans at the time. This most kind and hospitable gentleman furthermore promised to protect me during my stay in this neighborhood. And protection was something important for a school teacher because schools were being burned down, teachers were being killed or lynched or threatened at least with that. Shortly after I opened my school, the doctor loaned me $5, thereby showing that he had confidence in my honesty. Through his instrumentality, my name has become popular through Washington and Choctaw counties. I shall, for so long as life lasts, remember him with unfailing gratitude. So Coleman directs him up to this area, which is now called the little village of Frankville, and that's where he opened his school. This was probably plantation land at the time, so a lot of plantation, Coleman had owned 70 slaves before the war, and a lot of them were probably located here. So Nicholas Said would have been teaching his slaves, or his former slaves. The problem was, and I'm sorry, I apologize for this, the problem was the Department of Education statewide had just been founded and was pilfered, heavily pilfered by the state government. State government was just taking sometimes more than half the money to use on other operations. So you can see as this progresses, there were only 2 black teachers at the time in Washington County, about 10 white teachers. On that first chart, then you see that both him and Luke Taylor make $75 for the first quarter. The second chart, they only make $25. And you can't see it, but if you could, sorry about this. There's one column that's missing, but Luke Taylor actually, $8 he didn't get. So they were promised this money, but he didn't get $8. The third quarter, Luke Taylor has quit. He can't afford doing this anymore. He goes back to farming, which he'd been a farmer before. A white teacher named Jenny Williams teaches one of Alabama's few mixed race schools. So there are 1.5 teachers for the black community. She doesn't get paid any of the money she was owed, Nicholas Said only gets paid $82 out of $117 that he was owed. So gradually, everybody's seeing this money come down because the state is just, misappropriating the money. And there were 5 white teachers, well, there were 10 white teachers to begin with. By the third quarter, 5 of them had quit. They also weren't getting paid. It wasn't just the black teachers who weren't getting paid. And then after the third quarter, pretty much everybody quits. So Nicholas Said, he decides, okay, enough of that for now. I'm going to cross to Bladen Springs in Choctaw County. Bladen Springs right now, you go there, it's a state park, rest area, whatever. But at the time, it was called the Saratoga of the South. It was like Saratoga Springs in New York. It was a huge spa town, attracting a lot of very wealthy clientele with a lot of wealthy people living around it. The spa's waters were said to cure various illnesses. Its hotel could house 300 guests, with a ballroom, bowling alley, billiard room, croquet ground, and a bar. And Nicholas Said had, with his Russian prince friend, gone to some of the best spas in Europe. And he says, I'm constrained to say that these waters are the best that I ever used in my life. And I have used spas in Aix-la-Chapelle and Baden-Baden, et cetera. So, he decides, I'd like to stay here. But the main attraction is that there are a lot of pretty good businesses here, and they in turn provide employment for a lot of black workers, including carpenters, including blacksmiths, including highly paid servants. It isn't plantation land, which is what he'd been teaching at before. These are people who are actually making money and who can support a private school, not rely on state funding. And that's what they talked Nicholas Said into. So he teaches at a private school in Bladen Springs. To my great satisfaction, my pupils learned very fast. This, however, is not due to my skill in teaching so much as their capacity for imbibing or receiving instruction. I must here state that I always found colored children very apt in the South. Nicholas Said also got married there, although there's a question as to who he got married. This is from Clark County, his intention to get married. And on 28th of August, 1874, he intends to marry a woman named Rachel Thornton, also named Rachel Thornton on this issue. This is the actual marriage certificate. 1 month later, marrying Mornon Jackson. So hard to think that he was I don't think he was a polygamist, especially because it would be, kind of daring to marry 2 different people, a few miles apart. But I wonder if there's an explanation for it. That might have been Rachel Thornton, might have been her slave name, and maybe she decided to take this name instead. So, but anyway, he did get married. Can't be positive about the name. The person who signed his marriage certificate was the chief judge of Choctaw County, James Evans, and he had a son who became a journalist, who wrote, 20 years later, wrote a story about Nicholas Said. Said had a dash about him that was fascinating. Standing silently and erect, he looked as if a master hand had carved the figure from some piece of black stone. The way he carried himself was refreshingly graceful and pleasant. He was uniformly courteous. He knew something of political economy. He had studied the principles of law, possessed a smattering knowledge of physics and had read much on religious topics. On the stump, he seemed as one inspired. His sentences were short, clear-cut, and logical. Now, that's an interesting description. He was between the ages of 9 and 13 when he would have known Nicholas Light. So this is him remembering back 20 years to his pre-teen days. But still, I think that probably is the impression that Nicholas Light left on him. But one element of this story he wrote mysteriously appeared in Alabama in 1874 and quelled a race war. And what he's referring to is that both in 1874 and 1876, the election years, there were huge race riots of whites shooting at blacks, intimidating them at the polls. In one county, I think there were in one incident, there were 7 blacks killed, 70 wounded, and the white son of the local judge who was counting the vote, he was killed. This is a reference to that, the election riot of 1874. In Choctaw County, where Nicholas Light lived, there was a former slave who was trying to organize for the Republican Party. The Democrats, of course, were the slavery party. And as he's trying to organize, he says colored men have been assaulted, threatened, driven from their homes and families, and otherwise mistreated simply because they express their desire to support Republican candidates. And what Evans says that in the campaign of 1876, which was equally divisive as 1874, so he took the stump on behalf of the Tilden electoral ticket, Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and preached to his fellow men that the road to safety and harmony lay in voting the Democratic ticket. Somehow or other, he won the highest esteem from the white citizens, for it was he who brought about an understanding between the races. I don't fully believe his account for a number of reasons, but my guess is that what he was referring to is Nicholas Light probably told people to stay out of it, which, judging from the election at Bladen Springs, which is where he was living at the time, that's what they did. The black community did not vote Democratic, but they did not vote Republican either. They just, they thought, this time we're going to stay out of it. And again, that's very much the, and the difference between Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, that's very much the Booker T. Washington approach. And it probably, if he had followed Jack Turner's model, he might have been lynched as Jack Turner was 10 years later. So, so it would not have ended well either way, if that happened. So, he gets, while in Bladen Springs, he gets the eye of a doctor from New Orleans who actually helps him find a publisher finally for his autobiography, which was published in Memphis, Tennessee in 1873. And from what I understand, had a very good readership at the time, and you can still find some copies, musty copies that no one has read for a century, but some copies in university libraries and stuff. Now, of course, it's all online, which is how I read it. I've never read the original, but I have read the online version. So at the end, this is his trek to the South, including little schoolhouses where some of which he founded, some of which he taught at after they were founded. But he left a trail of schoolhouses, kind of like Johnny Appleseed, while he was doing his tour. He disappeared from the public eye in the 1870s. His last public record was in August 1882 when he was in Brownsville, Tennessee, living in a sharecropper's home while teaching school. And he probably either died or left the country by the mid-1890s, which is when he would have been in his early 60s or so. And this is, in his biography, is what I think his philosophy was. My honest and ardent desire is to render myself useful to my race wherever it may be. I have no aspirations for fame nor anything of the sort, but I shall always prefer at all times to find myself in the midst of the most ignorant of my race and endeavor to teach the rising generation the advantages of education. To me, it is impossible to conceive how a human being can be happy through any other channel than to do as much good as possible to his fellow man in this world. So that's Nicholas Said. That's
Awesome.